Welcome to Chapter 18, the Cardiovascular System, Part 1 of 2. In Chapter 1, we learned that the cardiovascular system included the following structures and/or organs: blood, the heart, and blood vessels. We studied blood in Chapter 17. We will focus on the heart in Chapter 18. More specifically, in Part 1, we will look at the location of the heart. We will study the external anatomy by looking at the protective coverings. We will study the internal anatomy by looking at the four chambers, as well as the valves. From there, we will actually trace the flow of blood through the heart and then finish up with the coronary circulation, or the heart's blood supply. Before we get into the anatomy of the heart, let's figure out where it is. For starters, the heart is about the size of your fist. Maybe take a moment right now to hold out your fist in front of you and appreciate the size of it and how it relates to the size of your heart. As far as where the heart is located, first of all, it's within the thoracic cavity. It's situated in between the left and right lungs. The heart sits on the diaphragm. The majority of the heart is slightly left of center, or slightly to the left of the mid-sternal line. And very basic, but the heart is anterior to the spine and posterior to the sternum. Two important aspects of the heart are the base and the apex. I like to think of the heart as a supermodel in that it kind of rotates its left shoulder back and then leans back in a chair. The base of the heart is really the posterior-inferior surface, and the apex is the bottom point that actually points towards the left hip. In the left image here, we are looking at an anterior view. You are able to see that the heart and the great blood vessels associated with it sit on top of the diaphragm, are located slightly left of center. Even though it looks like you're right, it is always the patient. So it is to the left of the patient's sternum. And you are able to see the apex, or the bottom point, which points towards the left hip. In the image seen on the right now, we have a transverse or horizontal cut. So say the patient is laying on the floor or on the table with their head through your computer screen and their feet coming out towards you. You are able to see a thoracic vertebrae on the posterior surface. And if you go slightly above that, you are able to see the sternum, which is not labeled here. But just posterior to the sternum, you see the heart. And you can appreciate the heart is slightly left of center. Again, the heart is contained within the thoracic cavity, more specifically in the mediastinum and within the pericardial cavity. Before we get into the heart, let's discuss what's on the outside of the heart, or the protective coverings. We have this structure or double-walled sac known as the pericardium, which will surround the heart. The pericardium includes two layers. The first is this fibrous pericardium, and as its name suggests, it's going to be dense or fibrous tissue that serves to not only protect, but also to anchor the heart to surrounding structures, so it's not just bouncing around in the chest. Deep to the fibrous pericardium now, we have the serous pericardium, which we learned about in Module 1. Remember, a serous membrane includes two layers, and in between those two layers, we have a fluid-filled space. But since we know where these layers are or what organ they're covering, we first have the parietal pericardium, or the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. This is found on the internal surface of the fibrous pericardium. Deep to the parietal pericardium, we have that space known as the pericardial cavity, where we will find serous fluid to reduce friction as the heart beats all day, every day. Directly adhered to the external surface of the heart, like the skin of an apple, we now find the visceral pericardium, or the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. But you need to note that this layer of the serous pericardium also serves as the outer wall of the heart, known as the epicardium. You will find many pictures and diagrams, including different views of the heart. So ensure that you maybe stop and pause at each one and identify the structures and truly understand it. From this picture, we are focusing on the coverings of the heart, or the pericardium. And you can see that this box image is taken from a little snippet of the superior aspect of the heart. But we are focusing on those layers that we just described. Remember, the pericardium includes two layers. The first was the fibrous pericardium that you can see pictured here. The second layer, or second part of the pericardium, is known as the serous pericardium, which also includes two layers. Remember, a serous membrane, no matter what organ it is covering, includes a parietal and a visceral layer, which are separated from each other by a fluid-filled cavity. Deep to the fibrous pericardium, we find the parietal pericardium, or the parietal layer of the serous pericardium, stuck to its internal surface. Deep to that, we are now in the pericardial cavity, which is filled with serous fluid to reduce friction. And then, doubling as the outer layer of the heart wall, we have the last part of the pericardium, known as the visceral pericardium. The visceral layer of the serous pericardium is directly adhered to the outer surface of the heart, which is why it doubles as the outer layer of the heart wall, known as the epicardium. Working our way into the heart now, we are through the protective coverings. We have studied the pericardium. Now we are actually looking at the physical wall of the heart. The heart is a hollow organ. These three layers listed here create that wall to surround the hollow spaces. Starting from outermost, we have the epicardium. Remember, the epicardium is also known as the visceral pericardium, or a portion of the pericardium protecting the heart. Deep to the epicardium now, the middle layer of the heart wall is known as the myocardium. Take a moment here and try to remember what that prefix myo meant. It means muscle. The myocardium, or that middle layer of the heart wall, is made up of cardiac muscle tissue. And lastly, the innermost layer of the heart wall is known as the endocardium. That prefix or term cardia, cardio means cardiovascular system or heart. The endocardium lines the internal wall of the heart. We will also see the endocardium become continuous with the great blood vessels that are attached to the heart. In the left image now, we have stripped everything off of the heart and left the myocardium, or the middle layer of the heart wall, which is cardiac muscle tissue. This cardiac muscle tissue is arranged in a certain way that allows for the heart to beat the way that it does. So if you look at the two more circular things that are wrapping around the top of the heart, those will squeeze in together, forcing blood towards the bottom or towards the apex. Then that bundle of cardiac muscle tissue twisting around towards the bottom will contract and force blood up and out through great blood vessels. The image on the right is the same image used 2 slides ago, only now instead of focusing on the pericardium, look at the 3 layers of the heart wall. Again, the epicardium, or the outermost layer of the wall, is the same as the visceral pericardium. Deep to that, we have bundles of cardiac muscle tissue making up the myocardium. And the innermost layer of the heart wall is known as endocardium. You may have heard that the heart is the pump of the body and that it pumps blood throughout the body. However, there are 2 sides to the heart. There is a right side of the heart and a left side. Each side functions differently in that it operates on a different circuit. So the heart is actually 2 pumps. The right side of the heart, every chamber and structure found on the right side consists of deoxygenated blood. The right side of the heart will receive deoxygenated blood from tissues in the body and then send that blood to the lungs. That is known as the pulmonary circuit. The left side of the heart and all of the chambers and structures contain oxygenated blood. The left side of the heart holds that oxygenated blood and sends it to working muscle and working tissue. That is known as the systemic circuit. If you are having trouble trying to wrap your head around the fact that the heart is a 2-sided pump, right and left, here is an image for you. Something that I cannot emphasize enough is that when you are looking at the heart, left and right are flip-flopped. In blue, that is the right side of the heart. The right side of the heart will receive deoxygenated blood from working tissue in the body and then send that blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. That is the pulmonary circuit. The left side of the heart now, seen here in red, red means oxygenated blood. The left side of the heart receives oxygen-rich blood from the lungs and then sends that blood to the working tissues or working muscles of the body. Try to follow this circuit around. You can pick any starting point and you will end up right where you started once you finish. Now we will continue with the internal anatomy of the heart. Let's try to make sense of what is on the right side and what is on the left side. But for starters, the inside of the heart contains 4 chambers or 4 rooms. We have 2 that are more superior and 2 that are a little bit larger and more inferior. Again, maybe pause and try to find those 4 chambers. On the right side of the heart, we have the right atrium. Ignore the large blue and red blood vessels for now. This is the right atrium. If you hop to the other side of the heart, we now find the left atrium. The atria are the 2 more superior chambers. They are also the receiving chambers in that they receive blood from somewhere in the human body. The left and right atria are separated from each other by a wall, known as the interatrial septum. Looking at that wall, more specifically in the right atrium, you see this indentation, or a depression, known as the fossa ovalis. In the fetal heart, this was actually open. It was actually an opening that connected the left and right atrium to each other. Then it was known as the foramen ovale. The two more inferior chambers now, much larger, include the right ventricle and the left ventricle. The ventricles are the discharging chambers. When the heart beats or contracts, blood leaves the heart from the ventricles. There is a thick wall separating the ventricles, known as the interventricular septum. There is never any mixing of blood between the right side and the left side of the heart. The images seen here are external views of the heart. So we cannot see the chambers because they are enclosed by the heart wall, or those three layers. On the left-hand side, this is an anterior view. Again, find the apex at the bottom. That points towards the left hip. In the image on the right, this is a posterior view. So you are looking at really the base of the heart, or the posterior-inferior surface. Again, ignore the large blue and red tubes coming off of the heart. The atria, left atrium and right atrium, are more superior. And then making up the majority of the heart are the ventricles, the left ventricle and the right ventricle. Also, looking at the surface of the heart, you need to be able to identify three grooves, or three sulci. The first is known as the coronary sulcus, or the atrioventricular groove. This will be the groove that encircles the atria and the ventricles, or where they connect to each other. We also have the anterior interventricular sulcus. Use this term or these terms to help you find it on the heart. This groove will be found on the anterior surface in between the ventricles. So about the anterior position of the interventricular septum, or the wall that separates the ventricles. Looking at the posterior side now, or the base of the heart, we see the posterior interventricular sulcus. You will see these on the next slide. However, they are filled with blood vessels, little blue and red vessels. Take a moment here now. Again, we have an anterior view and a posterior view. Try to identify the three surface features that we just described. The first is the coronary sulcus. This groove is found where the atria meet the ventricles. If you're looking at the image, some of the vessels that live in that groove will be the right coronary artery and the circumflex artery. Another groove that you have to be able to identify is the anterior interventricular sulcus. On the image in the left, the anterior interventricular artery is now in that sulcus. Looking at the image on the right, look for the posterior interventricular artery, which lives in the posterior interventricular sulcus, or groove. These grooves are great homes for blood vessels found on the heart surface. For now, we will just focus on the two more superior chambers of the heart, the left and right atrium. The atrium, or atria for both of them, are surrounded by a very thin wall, and they really don't contribute to propelling blood out of the heart and throughout the body. Again, that's mostly done by the ventricles. Hanging off of the atria now, we have auricles. An auricle means ear, but these will be appendages that allow for more filling volume, so the atria can fill with more blood. Looking at the inside of the atria, the walls have ridges on them that are formed by pectinate muscles. Remember, the left and right atria are the receiving chambers. You have to know where they receive blood from. The right atrium, it's on the right side of the heart, it has to be oxygen poor. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the body. We will see where specifically in the body on the next slide. The left atrium, left side of the heart, oxygen-rich blood. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the left and right lungs. The left atrium and right atrium are known as the receiving chambers of the heart, but you have to know where exactly they receive blood from. Remember, the right side of the heart, any chamber, right atrium or right ventricle, is deoxygenated blood. The left side of the heart includes left atrium and left ventricle, oxygen-rich blood. The right atrium receives blood from 3 vessels. The first is the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava is carrying deoxygenated blood from structures superior to the diaphragm, such as the upper limbs, the head, and the neck. The right atrium also receives deoxygenated blood from the inferior vena cava, a vein carrying deoxygenated blood from structures inferior to the diaphragm, like the abdominopelvic cavity and the lower limbs. And lastly, the right atrium also receives deoxygenated blood from the heart itself via the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus collects venous blood or deoxygenated blood from the heart and brings it to the heart. The left atrium receives blood from the lungs, but more specifically, it receives that oxygen-rich blood from 4 pulmonary veins. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, I only have 2 lungs, a left lung and a right lung. There are 2 pulmonary veins per lung, which gives you a total of 4. This is an image that you should become very familiar with, but now, in addition to identifying the 4 chambers, the left and right atria and the left and right ventricles, take it a step further and see if you can identify the vessels that empty into the atria. Remember, the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from 3 vessels. The first is the superior vena cava. The superior vena cava is this large blue tube emptying into the right atrium. It carries oxygen-poor blood from structures superior to the diaphragm. And on the opposite side here, the right atrium also receives oxygen-poor blood from the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava collects oxygen-poor blood from structures inferior to the diaphragm. And the one vessel that also returns to the right atrium, not pictured here, is the coronary sinus. It is best seen from the posterior view of the heart. The left atrium now receives blood from the lungs, but more specifically, it will receive oxygen-rich blood through 4 pulmonary veins, 2 from the left lung and 2 from the right lung. Let's look at the other 2 chambers of the heart, the left and right ventricle. These are the discharging chambers. So when the heart contracts, blood leaves the heart from these chambers, the discharging chambers. The ventricular walls are much thicker because they contain more muscle. More muscle means they are able to generate more force to propel that blood throughout the body. Not written on this slide, you have to know where these chambers discharge blood to. The right ventricle, containing oxygen-poor blood, will discharge blood into the pulmonary trunk. The left ventricle, containing oxygen-rich blood, will discharge blood into the largest artery of the body, known as the aorta. But also looking inside of the ventricles, we can see some ridges along the walls caused by muscle, which are known as trabeculae carneae. We saw a muscle similar to this in the atria, known as a pectinate muscle. Projecting into the ventricular cavity, we have more muscles known as the papillary muscles. Attached to the tops of these papillary muscles, we have tendinous cords that resemble the strings on a guitar. They are known as chordae tendineae, and they are anchoring that papillary muscle to a valve in the heart. By now, you should be very familiar with this image, and from it, you should be able to identify the left and right atrium, the great blood vessels that they receive blood from, the left and right ventricle, the irregular ridges caused by the trabeculae carneae in the ventricular wall, the finger-like projections into the ventricular cavity known as papillary muscles, extending off of the tops of the papillary muscles, the chordae tendineae, which anchor the papillary muscles to the valves of the heart. In this image here, we have made a horizontal or transverse cut through the heart, and we're just taking off the top, basically. But what I want you to appreciate here is the difference in wall thickness between the left ventricle and the right ventricle. The left ventricular wall is thicker because there is more cardiac muscle tissue. And that's because the left ventricle is responsible for ejecting blood to the entire body, all the way up to the head, down to the fingers, and all the way down to the toes. More muscle because there's more pressure. It needs to develop more force. Whereas the right ventricle is ejecting blood into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is just going to the left and right lung. And again, those organs sit directly on the sides of the heart. So it doesn't have to push blood far, which is why we see that difference in the thickness of the wall between the left and right ventricles. This image is taken from a cadaveric specimen or a human. So we have removed some of the heart wall in certain places. You should just simply be able to identify general areas of the left and right atrium, the left and right ventricle. But in addition to that, take a moment to appreciate the fact that the left ventricle makes up the majority of the anterior aspect of the heart. Also in this image, you are able to identify a papillary muscle, the trabeculae carneae, as well as some of the valves that we will get into on the next slide. As we continue to study the internal anatomy of the heart, we have to talk about valves. And overall, we have 4 valves in the heart. All 4 of them function to ensure that blood flows unidirectional, or in one direction. These valves also help to prevent backflow. Sometimes people think that the valves open and close or allow blood to pass or to not pass in response to muscle contraction, but that is not the case here. The valves of the heart will open and close to allow blood to move in response to pressure changes. There are 4 valves in the heart, as previously mentioned. We have 2 atrioventricular valves. These valves will separate the atria from the ventricles. The tricuspid valve will separate the right atrium from the right ventricle. The bicuspid or the mitral valve will separate the left atrium from the left ventricle. You may also see these valves known as the right AV valve and the left AV valve. But the name atrioventricular should tell you that it separates an atria or an atrium from its corresponding ventricle. The other 2 valves of the heart are known as semilunar valves, and they're named semilunar because their cusps, or the little doors, are shaped like half moons. The first is the aortic semilunar valve. This is found between the left ventricle and the aorta, or the largest artery in the body. The pulmonary semilunar valve is found between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Again, these valves ensure that blood flows one direction through the heart. They also ensure that there is no backflow of blood once blood has left that area. In this image here, we are looking at a superior view of the heart to get a better look at the 4 valves. So again, take a moment to identify the mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid valve, the tricuspid valve, the aortic semilunar valve, and the pulmonary semilunar valve. I should also note here that the terms bicuspid and tricuspid refer to the number of flaps associated with the valve. The mitral valve or the bicuspid valve, which separates the left atrium from the left ventricle, has 2 cusps. The tricuspid valve, which separates the right atrium from the right ventricle, has 3 cusps. Both semilunar valves have 3 cusps. Some more images of these valves. In the left, we are looking into the right ventricle. And I know that's the right ventricle because it tells you that we see a tricuspid valve flap. The tricuspid valve is also known as the right AV valve, separating the right atrium from the right ventricle. This view is taken from inside of the right ventricle. You are able to see the papillary muscle with the chordae tendineae coming off of the top of it and anchoring to the flaps or to the cusps of the tricuspid valve. In the image on the right, we have taken a cut through the heart to get, again, a better look at the atrioventricular valves. On the left side of the screen is the right side of the heart. So again, we have that tricuspid valve separating the right atrium from the right ventricle. Now on the right side of your screen is the left side of the heart. We can see the mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid valve, separating the left atrium from the left ventricle. Here is everyone's favorite image again. Now you should be able to identify the 4 chambers, the great vessels associated around the heart, the characteristics of the ventricular walls, like the trabeculae carneae and the papillary muscles. Now you should be able to identify the tricuspid and bicuspid valve. Take a moment to see how those valves are anchored to the papillary muscles via the chordae tendineae. And lastly, identify the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves, and note that they separate the ventricles from the vessels that they will eject blood into. One of the most important things that you need to take away from this lecture is understanding the pathway that blood will take throughout the heart. And no matter where you start, you will end there once you get through the entire circuit. I like to start in the right atrium. And I start in the right atrium by first identifying the 3 ways that I can get into the right atrium: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. The right atrium receives blood from those 3 vessels and then forces blood through the tricuspid valve. Once blood leaves the right atrium and passes through the tricuspid valve, it then enters the right ventricle. The right ventricle will contract and it will eject blood into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk will split into a left pulmonary artery and a right pulmonary artery. The pulmonary arteries will carry oxygen-poor blood to the lungs, where it will pick up oxygen. Now, the lungs are not a pump. The lungs cannot get oxygen-rich blood to the rest of the body. So we have to send that blood, now freshly oxygenated, back to the heart so it can do its job. From the lungs, oxygen-rich blood will enter the left atrium through 4 pulmonary veins. Once blood leaves the left atrium, it passes through the bicuspid or mitral valve. After it passes through that valve, it is now in the left ventricle. The left ventricle will contract. Blood will pass through the aortic semilunar valve and enter the aorta. The aorta will carry blood, oxygen-rich blood, to the working tissue and working muscle of the body. Once the working tissue and muscle of the body is done with it, that oxygen-poor blood now will end up back in the right atrium. Take a moment to truly understand this and use one of the many diagrams that I have provided for you to follow the pathway of blood throughout the heart. We will finish up this lecture by talking about coronary circulation. Remember, the term coronary means heart. We have seen that the heart is a working muscle and includes working tissue that relies on nutrients and oxygen so it's able to function. So we have a coronary circulation in place to allow for this. Now, coming off of the aorta, remember the left ventricle will contract. When the left ventricle contracts, it forces blood through the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta. But before the aorta carries that oxygen-rich blood to the head and neck, to the upper limbs, or to the lower limbs, the aorta sends blood to the heart. At the base of the aorta, we have 2 little blood vessels come off, the left and right coronary arteries. The right coronary artery will split into 2 branches, the marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. The right coronary artery will supply the right side of the heart, the right atrium, the right ventricle, and most of the posterior surface. The left coronary artery also has 2 branches, the anterior interventricular artery and the circumflex artery. The left coronary artery will supply oxygen and nutrient-rich blood to the left atrium, the left ventricle, and the anterior surface. In addition to understanding the coronary circulation, the two coronary arteries, and their branches, you should also be able to identify them. On the left side of the screen, we have demonstrated or highlighted the coronary arteries in red. Again, look for the aorta, which comes from the left ventricle. The two red tubes that come off of the aorta are the left and right coronary arteries. The left coronary artery will branch into an anterior interventricular artery and a circumflex artery. The right coronary artery will branch into a marginal artery and a posterior interventricular artery. The image seen on the right now is the venous circulation. Once we drop off that oxygen and nutrients, we pick up oxygen-poor blood and metabolic wastes using veins. The great cardiac vein lies next to the anterior interventricular artery. The middle cardiac vein is found alongside the posterior interventricular artery. And the small cardiac vein is adjacent to the right marginal artery. These three cardiac veins will push their blood into the coronary sinus. Remember, the coronary sinus was one of the three ways that we could enter the right atrium with oxygen-poor blood. This was Chapter 18, Part 1. We introduced the heart. We talked about where it was located, its protective coverings, and then we moved into the external and internal anatomy, finished up with the pathway of blood and coronary circulation.